3,500 years ago, when kingdoms were young and the world still trembled at the footsteps of its first empires, there were places where destiny gathered like storm clouds, places where ancient roads met, where wary rulers measured each other from afar, and where the ambitions of kings stretched toward a silent, indifferent sky. One such place was a hill in the heart of the ancient Levant, a hill the ancients called Megiddo. Today, it is nothing but a mound of layered dust and stone, but long ago, it was the gatekeeper of nations. Whoever controlled Megiddo controlled the crossroads between Africa and Asia, the lifeline of trade, armies, and ideas. For millennia, kings fought over this single ridge of earth, leaving behind ashes of cities built atop one another, 20 layers deep. But the battle that echoed loudest, the one that transformed this hill into legend, unfolded in the spring of 1457 BCE. Egypt, the greatest power of its age, found its influence slipping beyond the sands of the Nile. Vassal cities rebelled, kings conspired. At their head stood the formidable ruler of Kadesh, a man bold enough to unite the fractious princes of Canaan into a single defiant coalition. Their message was unmistakable. Egypt's time of dominance was over. But there was one man who refused to let his empire fall. Pharaoh Thutmose III, the warrior king. Young, ambitious, untested in open war, yet burning with the desire to carve his legacy into stone. This rebellion would give him that chance, and Megiddo, that ancient crossroads of ambition, would become the stage for his first great trial. What followed was a campaign of daring strategy, brutal combat, and decisions that would be studied by generals for millennia. A march across deserts, a gamble through a deadly mountain pass, a battle so fierce it echoed from the city walls to the temples of Karnak. Some called it fate, others destiny, but history remembers it as the first battle ever recorded in full detail. The battle where Egypt's empire was saved, and where the long shadow of Megiddo first fell across the ages. This is the story of the Battle of Megiddo. Long before the armies of Canaan dared to defy the Nile, Egypt stood as the unchallenged titan of the Near East. Its temples glowed with gold, its cities hummed with life, and its rulers commanded a kingdom that stretched from the first cataract to the edges of the Levant. This was the era of the 18th dynasty, the dynasty that gave birth to some of history's most extraordinary rulers. Conquerors, visionaries, builders of empire. At its heart stood a woman who changed the course of Egypt itself, Pharaoh Hatshepsut, a queen who ruled with the authority of a king, who revived the wealth of the kingdom, and who expanded Egypt's influence through trade and diplomacy rather than war. But as Hatshepsut reigned, another figure watched from the shadows of the throne, Thutmose, the rightful heir. A young prince raised by generals, trained in the art of war, yet unable to claim the battlefield as his own while Egypt lived in a time of peace. For nearly 2 decades, Egypt enjoyed stability, but outside the borders, unrest brewed. Across the rugged hills and fortified cities of Canaan, loyalty to Egypt had always been fragile. Vassal kings paid tribute because they feared the might of the pharaoh, not because they loved his rule. When Egypt's army stopped marching north, those kings grew bold. Tribute became irregular, rivalries sharpened, and whisper by whisper, the idea of rebellion began to spread. Trade routes through the Levant, arteries of wealth connecting Egypt to Syria and beyond, were threatened. City-states that had once bowed to the pharaoh began looking toward new alliances, new opportunities, and new leaders. By the time Hatshepsut's reign drew to a close, the edges of Egypt's empire were fraying, and all eyes turned toward the young man who would inherit this unstable world. Thutmose III, a king forged not in the calm of diplomacy, but in the restless fire of military ambition. He rose to the throne with the weight of expectation at his back, expected to restore discipline, reclaim lost loyalty, and reassert Egypt's supremacy in Canaan. The storm had been gathering for years, and now it was about to break. In the northern reaches of Canaan, Beyond the orchards of Galilee and the rugged ridges overlooking the Orontes River, rose a city whose pride matched its strength, Kadesh, a rival power among the Canaanite states. And its king, fierce, calculating, and ambitious, sensed opportunity in the shifting winds of empire. For years, Egypt's hand had grown lighter. No grand armies marched through the valleys. No stern messengers demanded tribute. With Hatshepsut's quiet policies and Egypt's gaze turned inward, the vassal cities of the Levant began to wonder, had the age of Egyptian dominance passed? The king of Kadesh believed it had, and he moved quickly. With practiced skill, he whispered rebellion into the courts of Canaanite princes, Megiddo, Hazor, Beth Shemesh, Kadesh, Tunip. From city to city, his envoys traveled under moonlit nights, promising liberation, alliance, and rich plunder if Egypt's grip finally broke. Old rivalries were soothed, new oaths sworn. And in time, a coalition emerged, a patchwork of chariot lords, foot soldiers, and hill country princes united by a rare sentiment, defiance. At its heart stood Megiddo, a city perched atop a fertile crossroads where three great trade arteries met. Whoever controlled Megiddo could channel the wealth of caravans, command the passes, and shape the destiny of the region. It was more than a stronghold. It was a symbol, a statement, a challenge. And so the king of Kadesh chose Megiddo as the seat of rebellion, not only for its strategic value, but for its message, that Egypt, once feared across the world, could be confronted openly. From its towering walls, banners of revolt rose. Caravans that once paid tribute to the Pharaoh turned away, and Canaanite soldiers gathered by the thousands, some for gold, others for revenge, all with hope that the old lion of the Nile had finally grown weak. But deep within the palaces of Thebes, messengers carried troubling reports. Tribute withheld, alliances forming, loyalties shifting like sand in a storm. The fragile peace Egypt had enjoyed was on the brink of collapsing. This was no small uprising. It was a coalition strong enough to carve Egypt out of the Levant entirely. A spark powerful enough to ignite the first true test of Pharaoh Thutmose's reign. And as the fires of rebellion spread across Canaan, the young pharaoh prepared to answer. In the palaces of Thebes, where incense curled beneath painted ceilings and the Nile shimmered beyond temple walls, a young king prepared to face the defining test of his life. Thutmose III, newly ascended, newly independent, and determined to prove that Egypt's power had not dimmed with time. For years, he had lived in the long shadow of a remarkable predecessor. Hatshepsut, the queen who ruled as pharaoh, had been Egypt's stabilizer, its diplomat, its architect of peace. She expanded Egypt's wealth through trade expeditions and alliances, not by force of arms. Yet while her reign strengthened the kingdom, it also left the warrior prince with a restlessness he could not express. Thutmose had been raised for war. From childhood, he trained with chariots, drew the bow, mastered the spear, studied maneuver and formation beneath the watchful eyes of Egypt's greatest generals. He learned to command soldiers before he ever ruled a nation. But as long as Hatshepsut lived, his ambitions remained locked behind the calm of her diplomacy. When she passed, the gates opened. In the early months of his rule, Thutmose moved with a focus sharpened by years of waiting. He reasserted control over the temples, he strengthened the officer corps, and he signaled to every corner of the Levant that a new kind of pharaoh now sat the throne. One who would restore Egypt's dominance through strength, not negotiation. But rebellion does not wait for a king to find his footing. As the coalition in Canaan grew bolder, messages reached Thebes describing withheld tribute, shifting alliances, and the rising influence of the king of Kadesh. What had begun as a whisper now threatened the stability of the entire northern empire. For Thutmose, this was more than politics, it was personal. To him, the rebellion was an insult, a public challenge to his authority, issued at the very moment he sought to establish his name. It was proof that the world believed him untested, perhaps unworthy of the crown. And so he made a decision with absolute clarity. He would meet the rebels not with envoys, but with an army. Egypt would march. And Thutmose III, long held back from the battlefield, would finally seize the role for which he had been shaped since childhood, the warrior king, leading his forces into the storm. When the order to march echoed across Egypt, the response was immediate and thunderous. From delta marshes to desert fortresses, soldiers felt the shift in the air. War was coming, and the pharaoh himself would lead them. The Nile's riverbanks, usually calm with fishermen and traders, erupted with military purpose. Scribes hurried through barracks, tallying weapons and recording every man fit for service. Blacksmiths hammered bronze until sparks danced across the sand. Leatherworkers tightened chariot straps and shaped shields. Every clang of metal carried the same message: Egypt was awakening. Troops streamed into the mobilization points. Archers from Upper Egypt arrived with composite bows polished to shine in the sun. Infantry marched in tight ranks, shields decorated with symbols of their nomes. Nubian allies joined them, bringing unmatched skill in close combat. Charioteers prepared their horses, sleek, disciplined animals that stamped the ground impatiently. Food caravans, water supplies, tools, and medical kits formed the second army behind the first, an essential lifeline that would sustain the massive force on its long march north. And at the core of it all stood Thutmose III. Wearing the blue war crown, he moved among his troops with a composure that inspired confidence. Soldiers saluted him not as a distant figure on a throne, but as the commander who would ride into battle beside them. He spoke to captains, inspected ranks, and gave blessings to chariot teams. His presence alone transformed tension into determination. As preparations intensified, the rituals began. Priests walked among the formations, casting incense into the air, invoking Amun's favor. Standards topped with falcons, cobras, and jackals fluttered in the wind, reminding all that the gods marched with Egypt. When the final horn sounded, the army surged forward in a roar of movement. Dust rose behind thousands of feet and spinning chariot wheels as the pharaoh's forces headed north. Villagers watched from the riverbanks, seeing the gleam of bronze stretch beyond the horizon. Egypt had not marched like this in a generation. And now it marched toward Megiddo, toward rebellion, risk, and destiny. When the Egyptian army reached the fortified town of Yehem, the true test of strategy began. Here, beneath the shade of its protective walls, Thutmose III summoned his generals. Scrolls were unfurled, stones placed on their corners to hold them against the wind, and the commanders gathered around the maps that would determine the course of the campaign. 3 roads led to Megiddo. The northern road was wide, predictable, and safe. It offered steady ground and easy movement. Most generals pointed to it immediately. The enemy would expect Egypt to come this way, but it was secure and familiar. The southern route was longer but equally safe. It skirted the hills and opened into the plains, allowing the army to regroup before battle. Some officers favored it for its logistical simplicity. Then there was the third option, the Aruna Pass. A narrow, twisting gorge capable of swallowing the army whole. Chariots would have to be dismantled. Infantry would move single file. If the Canaanites waited inside, Egypt could be trapped and destroyed before even reaching Megiddo. The generals were unanimous in rejecting it. They warned the pharaoh, "If the enemy ambushes us there, our campaign ends in disaster." Their faces were tense, their voices careful. They knew the risks were enormous. Thutmose studied the map in silence. He understood something deeper. The coalition would assume he would avoid the pass. They would guard the northern and southern roads heavily. But Aruna, the most dangerous path, would likely be the least defended. It was a risk, but also an opportunity. And so the pharaoh made his decision. We marched through Aruna. The council erupted in shock. Officers protested. Some pleaded for caution. But Thutmose had already envisioned the advantage such a maneuver would give. Boldness had carried him this far. Boldness would carry him to Megiddo. The orders spread. Tension mixed with excitement. The soldiers prepared themselves for a path few armies would dare attempt. Egypt's future would depend on this gamble. And with that choice, Thutmose III stepped fully into the role history had prepared for him, a commander willing to risk everything for victory. Before sunrise, as the desert air clung cool around the army, Egypt stood at the mouth of the Aruna Pass. It was a narrow, twisting cut in the hills, so tight and shadowed it seemed less a road and more a warning. Even seasoned soldiers felt the weight of it. The risks were obvious. The pass could strangle the army into a single fragile line. Chariots had to be dismantled, horses led by hand. Every footstep echoed off the stone walls, magnifying even the smallest sound into something ominous. Yet Thutmose III had chosen this path. Men tightened their grips on spears. Archers kept arrows half-drawn. Scouts moved ahead, peering over ridges where a single hidden lancer could unleash disaster. Every twist in the road was a moment of tension, each a place where the enemy should have been waiting. But no ambush came. The march became a slow ritual of endurance. Sandals scraped stone. Donkeys groaned beneath the weight of dismantled chariots. Sweat trickled down faces as the rising sun turned the gorge into a furnace. But the pharaoh walked near the front, matching the pace of his soldiers. His calm presence steadied the army like a hand pressed on a trembling pulse. Hours passed. The pass narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again. Each bend held a new possibility for death, yet still the rocks remained silent. Finally, a glow of warm light spilled ahead. The army emerged from the darkness into open fields, blinking against the sudden brightness. Relief washed through the ranks. Men exhaled breaths they didn't realize they'd been holding. Cheers broke out as chariots were quickly reassembled. They had done the impossible. They had passed unseen through the one route the rebels believed no army would ever dare take. And now Egypt stood behind the enemy's prepared lines, closer to Megiddo than the Canaanite coalition had ever expected. The gamble had paid off, but the shock it delivered was only just beginning. Just after dawn, a lone rider galloped into the Canaanite camp, dust trailing behind him like smoke. He threw himself before the commanders and delivered the news they thought impossible. The Egyptians, they came through Aruna. For a heartbeat, the coalition leaders stared in stunned silence. Then panic broke loose. Their entire strategy had hinged on Egypt avoiding the dangerous pass. Their chariots guarded the broad northern road. Their infantry watched the southern route. But the Egyptians had bypassed them entirely and were now on open ground far too close for comfort. The camp erupted in frantic activity. Soldiers rushed to form new lines, shouting over one another as commanders scrambled for control. Charioteers yanked horses into position, racing to correct their disastrous misplacements. Archers sprinted across the camp to reach higher ground. The rebels had prepared for a predictable approach. Now they faced chaos. Above them, Megiddo's towering walls cast long shadows across the plains. Civilians and soldiers alike crowded the battlements, watching their allies struggle to reorganize. What had started as a confident stand against Egypt was dissolving into disarray. Some Canaanite princes argued for retreat into the city. Others demanded they meet the Egyptians before they gained momentum. Every delay, every disagreement, tightened the noose Thutmose III had placed around them with one bold decision. For the first time, the coalition felt uncertainty shift into fear. They had expected caution from the young pharaoh. Instead, they found daring. And Egypt, fresh from the pass, emboldened by the gamble, was ready to strike while their enemy reeled. The plains of Megiddo were about to erupt. The sun rose hard and bright over the fields beneath Megiddo, painting the landscape gold as Egypt's soldiers emerged onto the open plains. Before them, the rebellious city loomed, a fortress perched on its tell, its walls crowded with anxious onlookers. The plain stretched wide and flat, a perfect arena for the confrontation this campaign had been building toward. Across the field, the Canaanite coalition scrambled to form ranks. Their chariots rolled unevenly into place, dragged from positions designed for a different battlefield approach. Infantry hurried beneath shifting banners. Commanders shouted in competing voices, trying to impose order on a disorganized mass. Egypt, by contrast, moved like a machine. Chariot divisions fanned out to the flanks. Archers arranged themselves in layered ranks. Infantry advanced in tight, disciplined blocks, shields polished by the rising sun. Dust lifted beneath thousands of synchronized steps. At the center of it all rode Thutmose III. His chariot gleamed with gold. His horses snorted clouds of breath into the warming air. The blue war crown shimmered as he surveyed the enemy, calm, focused, fearless. The soldiers looked to him and felt their nerves settle. Their pharaoh was not behind them, he was among them. Then he raised his bow. A horn blasted, a single deep note that cracked the tension like lightning. Egyptian archers stepped forward and unleashed a storm of arrows. The sky darkened briefly with their arc. They fell into the Canaanite ranks with devastating precision, sending men reeling before their lines even solidified. The coalition staggered, and Egypt seized the moment. Chariots surged ahead, wheels carving deep trenches into the soil. Horses lunged forward with explosive power as bronze blades mounted to chariot hubs sliced through shields and spears. Dust swirled around them, turning the field into a storm of motion. The infantry clashed next. Egyptian shield-bearers pressed forward, locking formation as they drove spears into the disoriented Canaanite foot soldiers. The rebels fought fiercely. This was their homeland, their rebellion. But they could not match the organization or the momentum of the Egyptian assault. The Canaanites attempted to rally with a countercharge. Their chariots thundered across the field in a concentrated push aimed at breaking Egypt's center. But Thutmose responded instantly. He signaled his wings, and Egyptian chariot crews swung inward in a sweeping arc, flanking the attack. Arrows rained down from both sides. Canaanite drivers toppled from their vehicles. Horses collapsed in tangled heaps. What had begun as a daring counterstroke dissolved into another wave of chaos. Amid the whirlwind, the pharaoh drove straight into the heart of the battle. Thutmose's chariot cut through the fray like a comet. The king, drawing and releasing arrows with deadly precision, struck standard-bearers, chieftains, and officers trying to restore order. His presence broke whatever cohesion the coalition still clung to. And then, finally, the lines buckled. The rebels' left flank collapsed first, then their center. Panic rippled outward. Men who had stood proudly hours earlier now fled toward Megiddo's distant gates, desperate for the safety of its walls. Their retreat became a stampede, chariots overturning, soldiers colliding, standards falling in the dust. Egypt pressed forward, unstoppable. The field that had seemed so wide that morning now felt small, filled with shouts, crashing wood, and the metallic ring of weapons. The Canaanites had underestimated Egypt's speed, its precision, its king, and now they raced to escape the disaster unfolding around them. The plains of Megiddo, fertile and peaceful only days before, had become the stage for one of the most decisive routs in ancient history. And the coalition, broken in the open field, fled for their final refuge behind the walls of Megiddo. The retreat toward Megiddo was wild, frantic, and filled with desperation. The coalition's proud ranks dissolved into a river of fleeing soldiers. Egyptian chariots pursued them relentlessly, their wheels tearing through the churned earth. At the city's gates, panic reached its peak. The defenders, terrified that Egyptians might storm the entrance behind the fleeing army, began to close the massive wooden doors. Those still outside screamed in protest, hurling themselves forward, fighting for any chance to get inside. What followed became one of the most unforgettable scenes of the entire campaign. Canaanite nobles and soldiers, trapped outside as the gates shut, scrambled up the walls using improvised ropes, belts, cloaks, tunics tied together in frantic knots. From below, they dangled awkwardly as comrades pulled them upward with desperate strength. The great princes of Canaan, once united in defiance, now clung to the walls of Megiddo like fugitives. And just beyond them, Thutmose's troops surged across the field. The opportunity was perfect. With discipline, Egypt could have stormed the gates before they fully closed, ending the entire war in a single moment. But something shattered that chance. Discipline broke. Sensing victory and dazzled by the abandoned wealth of the Canaanite camp, many Egyptian soldiers turned to plunder instead of pursuit. Tents were torn open. Gold cups, weapons, garments, and horses were seized in a frenzy of excitement. By the time officers restored order, it was too late. The gates had slammed shut. The last rebels had escaped inside. What should have been a total victory became only the beginning of a long ordeal. Thutmose III surveyed the field with a mixture of triumph and frustration. The enemy had been crushed, but not captured. One moment of lost discipline had changed everything. He did not waste time on anger. He knew the truth. Megiddo could not be taken by force now. Its walls were too high, its gates too strong. A direct assault would cost lives he refused to spend on pride. So he chose patience. The war would not end on the plains, but at the walls. And if the rebels wanted safety behind their fortress, then their fortress would become their cage. The pharaoh turned from the city and began preparing for the next phase, the siege that would break the last breath of rebellion. Megiddo's gates shut like a trap snapping closed. The Canaanite princes believed they had saved themselves, but in that moment, they sealed their fate. Thutmose III acted immediately. The battlefield still echoed with the chaos of retreat when he summoned his engineers, architects, and officers. His objective was clear. Megiddo would not be stormed. It would be contained. And so Egypt began to build a prison around the city. Thousands of soldiers moved with practiced efficiency. Timber stripped from nearby groves was hauled across the plains. Stakes were driven deep into the earth. Carpenters hammered, sawed, and lashed beams together as engineers directed the construction. A wooden wall, nearly a full ring, rose around Megiddo. Later called the Wall of Thutmose, it consisted of palisades, guard towers, observation points, and trenches lined with sharpened stakes. Egyptian archers climbed the towers and trained their bows on the city's gates day and night. Ditches slowed any attempt at escape. Patrols swept the surrounding countryside to cut off messengers and supplies. Megiddo was effectively sealed. And outside the walls, another city took shape. The Egyptian camp sprawled across the plains, rows of tents, storage depots, mess stations, forges, and medical tents. Smoke from cook fires curled upward. Horses grazed in organized paddocks. Priests conducted rituals to maintain morale, while scribes kept meticulous records of rations, captured goods, and daily events. Megiddo, once a proud stronghold, now found itself the centerpiece of a vast, disciplined machine designed to choke it into submission. From the battlements, the Canaanite leaders watched the encirclement tighten, powerless to stop it. The realization settled over them like a shadow. Their fortress was now a cage, and the pharaoh held the key. A long, unforgiving siege had begun. Sieges do not explode like battles. They grind, they wear, they wait. In Megiddo, time itself became an enemy. Inside the city, daily life shrank into survival. Food was rationed with merciless precision. Sacks of grain that once fed families for weeks were now stretched to last months. Livestock dwindled until only the weakest animals remained. Celebratory meals became distant memories. Even the wealthy felt the pinch. Noble families who once dined on imported delicacies now ate thin porridge beside their servants. The difference between rich and poor narrowed into a shared hunger. Tension crept through the alleys. Quiet arguments broke out in dark corners. Some wanted to negotiate, others clung to pride. All feared the same truth: supplies were running out. On the walls, sentries watched the Egyptian camp with growing dread. They saw Egypt's steady rhythm, soldiers trained, horses fed, messengers came and went. The besiegers were comfortable, unhurried, patient. Outside, life continued. Egyptian soldiers drilled to maintain discipline. Scouts patrolled the plains. Smiths kept weapons sharp. Priests offered prayers to Amun, reinforcing the belief that this war was sanctioned by the gods. Competitions in archery and wrestling helped pass the long hours. The pharaoh's presence kept morale high. But the Canaanites didn't sit idle. They launched desperate nighttime sorties, small, furious attempts to break through the ring. They struck with surprise, torches flaring in the dark, shouting as they pushed against the palisades. But each attack was repelled. The wall of Thutmose held firm. The failed attempts cost them dearly. Inside Megiddo, despair grew. Wells ran low. Disease spread through cramped quarters. Children cried from hunger. Elders weakened. The coalition princes, once united in boldness, now argued behind closed doors, each trying to place blame on the other. They waited for reinforcements from Kadesh. None came. The longer the siege lasted, the clearer it became. The rebellion had been abandoned. The princes inside the city were alone. As the months crept on, towards 7 long, unforgiving cycles of the moon, something finally broke within Megiddo's walls. Not stone, not gates, but hope. And once hope collapsed, surrender was inevitable. One morning, as pale light washed across the plain, Megiddo's gates opened, not with defiance, but resignation. A procession of princes and nobles stepped out barefoot, their garments dusty and worn. They approached the pharaoh's pavilion with heads bowed, carrying no weapons, only symbols of surrender. Thutmose III waited beneath a gilded canopy, composed and resolute. When the princes knelt before him, touching their foreheads to the earth, the rebellion that had shaken Canaan ended in quiet submission. The pharaoh spared them. He allowed the rulers to keep their positions, under strict Egyptian oversight. For Thutmose understood that mercy, when paired with undeniable dominance, secured loyalty better than bloodshed. Then came the accounting. Scribes recorded the spoils with precise strokes: hundreds of chariots, thousands of horses, fine armor, gold and silver vessels, embroidered garments, and stores of grain. Families of rebel leaders, wives, children, attendants, were catalogued as captives under Egyptian control. The wealth taken from Megiddo was immense. But the greater prize was political. Egypt's authority had been restored, unquestioned, unchallenged. The northern territories once again bowed to the throne of the Nile. The princes had gambled everything, and the pharaoh had taken it all. The fall of Megiddo did more than restore order. It reshaped the balance of the ancient world. With the rebellion crushed, Egypt's path into the Levant lay open, and its young pharaoh, tested by fire, stepped confidently into the age of conquest. Megiddo was Thutmose III's turning point. What began as a dangerous gamble had revealed his brilliance. He had marched boldly, chosen risk over caution, and emerged victorious. The campaign became the foundation of his reputation. The moment the world recognized him not as Hatshepsut's successor, but as a king in his own right. And he did not slow. In the years that followed, Thutmose launched campaign after campaign into Syria and beyond. He crossed the Orontes, seized key fortresses, and extended Egyptian influence farther north than any pharaoh before him. City-states that had once wavered under Egyptian rule now bowed quickly, aware of the fate that awaited those who rebelled. Tribute caravans poured into Egypt: gold, timber, copper, wine, horses, and exotic goods from lands long out of reach. Temples expanded, artisans flourished, and Egypt entered a golden age built on the foundation of Megiddo. But the victory's true legacy was deeper. Megiddo restored fear. It reminded the Near East that Egypt was not a fading power, but a relentless force guided by a leader who understood both strategy and resolve. The princes who had once whispered of independence now sent messages of loyalty, eager to prove themselves compliant. For Egypt, Megiddo was proof that empire could be reforged. For Thutmose III, it was the battle that made him immortal. With the war won, the swords sheathed, and the last smoke fading from the plains, another task began, one quieter but just as important. Egypt would not allow the memory of Megiddo to slip into rumor. The victory would be preserved with precision. It fell to the scribes to capture the campaign. These were not warriors, but craftsmen of memory, men who followed the army with palettes and papyri, recording every movement with meticulous care. They wrote of the march, the council at Yehem, the risk of the Aruna Pass, the clash beneath the city walls, and the long siege that followed. Then, when the army returned home, their records were transferred to stone. In the great temple of Amun at Karnak, artisans carved the story of Megiddo across towering walls. Hieroglyphs marched in long, steady columns, interrupted by scenes of battle, chariots charging, archers firing, Thutmose standing tall in his chariot. The entire campaign, its risks, decisions, and triumphs, was immortalized. For the first time in history, a battle was recorded not in vague lines of poetry, but in detailed, organized sequence. Megiddo became the earliest fully documented battle ever known. It allowed later generations, scholars, generals, kings, to study tactics and logistics from a war fought centuries before their own. Even today, the inscriptions offer insight into strategy, supply lines, and military thinking in the Bronze Age. Thutmose III understood the power of memory. To rule the future, one must control the past. By carving the story into stone, he ensured that his victory could not be twisted, forgotten, or overshadowed. It would endure as long as the temple stood. And as the centuries passed, the stones remained, faded, weathered, but still speaking. They tell us not just that a battle was fought, but how. Megiddo should have vanished like so many ancient cities, buried under dust, forgotten by time. But the ground that had witnessed so much conflict refused to fade. Across the centuries, armies returned. Egyptians, Israelites, Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, Romans, each marched across the same plains, drawn by the irresistible pull of geography. Megiddo guarded the roads that connected continents, and whoever controlled it controlled the flow of power. Each conquest left its mark, burned layers, collapsed walls, rebuilt fortresses. Megiddo became a layered history book, a place where every generation wrote its chapter in stone and ash. Even the name changed. In Hebrew, it became Har Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo. Over time, the name passed through the hands of prophets and storytellers, gaining weight and symbolism. Eventually, it transformed into a word that would echo across cultures and centuries: Armageddon. A name no longer tied only to a hill in Canaan, but to visions of final battles, the end of days, and the ultimate struggle between light and darkness. Yet the real Megiddo, its stones, its ruins, its soil, remains surprisingly quiet. Archaeologists continue to peel back its layers, uncovering gates, temples, stables, and burn marks from wars long forgotten. Every excavation confirms the same truth. Megiddo was not the site of a single great battle, but of many. A crossroads of ambition, a magnet for conflict. And among all the wars fought there, one stands out. Thutmose III's victory, preserved in stone, remembered in history, is the moment that cemented Megiddo's place in the world's imagination. A hill that refused to die, a name that evolved into myth, and a battlefield that still whispers across time.